What is the worst part of betrayal? It is the moment they erase 10 years of your life with a smirk inside the home you built. When my husband brought his mistress home on Christmas Eve and threw me into a freezing blizzard, he thought he took everything. He never knew my silent father had set a flawless trap 10 years ago. My husband thought he was the hunter, but he was just stepping onto the guillotine. Hello to all our wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. We are incredibly grateful for your continuous support, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with no budget to operate, which means we will soon have to stop publishing new videos here. If you enjoyed today's story, please support us by joining our Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel to listen to exclusive, true stories that are even better, longer, and more detailed, featuring multiple emotional voice actors in a single story, which we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code on the screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story as we follow the journey of a woman named Irene Hogan. I am 34 years old, and on the night my entire world collapsed into absolute nothingness, I was fighting my way through a blinding, ferocious blizzard in Telluride, Colorado. The wind was screaming against the windshield of my car, the snow coming down in thick, heavy sheets that made it almost impossible to see the road ahead. I was driving back a day early from an exhausting, week-long business trip. My body was completely drained, my bones aching from back-to-back client meetings and endless revisions of architectural blueprints. But I pushed through the fatigue. I was desperate to return to the sanctuary I had built. For 10 years, my husband, Marcus, and I had poured our blood, sweat, and tears into Luminaire Design, an architectural firm that was supposed to be our shared legacy, our shared empire. I was the creative force, the architect who breathed life into empty spaces and turned concrete into art, while Marcus handled the business, the legalities, and the numbers. I trusted him with my life, and the thought of surprising him for Christmas Eve kept my foot steady on the gas pedal. Pulling up to the sweeping driveway, the multi-million-dollar mansion stood like a glowing, majestic beacon against the frozen, dark mountain landscape. I had designed every single inch of this home, from the vaulted, exposed timber ceilings to the massive floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows that overlook the snowy valley. It was my absolute masterpiece. The stone fireplace, the custom oak floors, the intricate lighting system, every detail came from my own mind. I expected to walk into the quiet, familiar warmth of my husband's embrace, to smell pine needles and perhaps a fire burning in the hearth. Instead, when I pushed the heavy front door open, the deafening sound of clinking crystal glasses, loud music, and roaring laughter hit me like a physical blow to the chest. There was a lavish, spectacular dinner party happening right in my dining room. The grand chandelier I had custom ordered from Italy was casting a golden, sparkling glow over a massive table spread with expensive catering, fine wine, and elaborate holiday decorations I had never seen before. And there, standing confidently at the head of the table, was Marcus. He was raising a glass of expensive champagne, looking more handsome and relaxed than he had in months. Next to him was Vivian, his older sister, a woman who had always looked at me like dirt under her designer shoes, constantly seething with jealousy over my career and my undeniable talent. And clinging tightly to Marcus's left arm was a young, striking blonde woman I had never met. Her name, I would soon painfully learn, was Chloe. The loud laughter died the absolute second my snowy boots stepped onto the polished hardwood floor. The room fell into a suffocating, dead silence. I stood there, shivering uncontrollably from the cold, holding my small overnight bag, waiting for an explanation, a panicked excuse, a sudden apology, anything. But Marcus did not flinch. He did not drop his glass. He did not look guilty. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne, looked me dead in the eyes, and smiled a cold, practiced, terrifyingly calm smile. "You are home early, Irene," he said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion or remorse. This actually saves me a rather annoying phone call. I want a divorce. I thought it was a sick, twisted holiday joke. My freezing brain simply could not process the words coming out of his mouth. But then, to my absolute horror, he proudly placed his hand over Chloe's slightly rounded stomach. "Chloe is pregnant," Marcus announced, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather forecast. "This is the real family I have always wanted. The family you were always too busy with your little blueprints and construction sites to give me." Before I could even open my mouth to defend myself, before I could scream or cry, Vivian stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with pure, malicious joy. She had been waiting for a moment exactly like this for an entire decade. She violently grabbed my overnight bag from my frozen, trembling fingers, unzipped it, and dumped my few pieces of travel clothing right onto the dirty floor. "Do not look so shocked, you pathetic freeloader," Vivian sneered, maliciously kicking one of my sweaters out of her way. "You really thought you were an equal partner in any of this? Marcus owns the company. Marcus owns this beautiful house. Your name is not on a single piece of paper. Irene, you are nothing but a hired hand who has completely overstayed her welcome." I looked desperately at Marcus, silently begging him to stop his sister, to tell me this was some kind of nightmare, to show even a fraction of the love he had promised me for 10 years. But he just stood there, crossing his arms comfortably over his expensive cashmere sweater, watching me break. "Vivian is right," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, icy, commanding register. "I own Luminaire. I own the assets. Have some self-respect. Irene, leave tonight. Oh, and leave the company credit cards and the keys to the SUV on the kitchen counter. Those belong to my firm." They expected me to scream. They expected me to fall to my knees, to beg, to cry hysterically in front of his pregnant mistress and his venomous sister. But absolute, catastrophic shock does a strange thing to a human being. It completely paralyzes the vocal cords and freezes the tears long before they can even form in your eyes. I refused to lose the last shred of my dignity in front of these cold-blooded, heartless monsters. I slowly bent down, silently gathered my scattered clothes, and stuffed them into an old, broken suitcase Vivian had tossed from the coat closet. I reached into my pocket and placed the car keys and the platinum credit cards gently onto the marble kitchen island. Without uttering a single word, I turned my back on the home I built, the company I founded, and the man I had loved with all my heart, and walked right back out into the freezing night. The temperature outside had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius. The howling wind cut through my thin wool coat like sharp razor blades. But the brutal physical pain of the blizzard was absolutely nothing compared to the violent, tearing sensation inside my chest. Every single step felt like walking barefoot on broken glass. For 2 agonizing miles, I dragged that broken suitcase through the knee-deep snow, blind with unimaginable betrayal and practically freezing to death. I had no money, no car, and nowhere else to go. I kept putting one freezing foot in front of the other until I finally saw the faint, flickering porch light of a secluded wooden cabin hidden deep in the pine trees. It was the quiet, isolated home of my father, Arthur. I collapsed heavily against his thick wooden door, knocking with the very last ounce of strength I had left in my freezing body. The heavy oak door swung open before I could raise my frozen fist to knock a second time. My father stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing silhouette against the warm, flickering amber light of his cabin. He did not gasp. He did not ask a single frantic question. He simply took one look at my snow-covered, trembling frame, stepped aside, and gently pulled me into the overwhelming warmth of his home. The contrast between the deadly blizzard outside and the safety of his sanctuary was so profound that my knees immediately gave out. He caught me before I hit the wooden floorboards. He guided me to the worn leather armchair positioned right beside the roaring stone fireplace. Still utterly silent, he stripped away my heavy, ice-soaked coat and wrapped a massive, thick wool blanket tightly around my shivering shoulders. He walked over to his small rustic bar, poured a generous measure of dark, rich bourbon into a heavy crystal glass, and pressed it firmly into my freezing hands. The intense heat of the liquor burned a sudden, reviving path down my throat, violently thawing the ice that had formed around my lungs, and then the shock finally shattered. The dam broke. I buried my face in my hands and sobbed. I wept with an agonizing, guttural intensity, pouring out 10 years of wasted love, shattered dreams, and profound humiliation. My father sat in the chair opposite mine, perfectly still, letting me cry until my chest ached and my tear ducts were completely dry. When the violent shaking finally subsided into quiet, exhausted hiccups, I began to speak. My voice was hoarse, fractured, and barely above a whisper. I told him everything. I told him about the extravagant dinner party, about Vivian's vicious taunts, about Chloe's pregnancy, and about the horrifying reality of my own foolishness. The shame burned hotter than the bourbon. I confessed how utterly naive I had been to trust Marcus with the legal foundation of our entire life. I explained how I had willingly signed away my leverage because I only wanted to focus on the creative design, the architecture, the pure art of Luminare. I thought business was just tedious paperwork. I let him put his name on the company registration, the bank accounts, the deed to the multi-million-dollar mansion I had designed from scratch. I had handed the man I loved a loaded gun, and he had just pulled the trigger without a second thought. Through my entire pathetic confession, Arthur did not offer a single word of pity. He sat in the dim shadows of the cabin, the orange firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. Most people in Telluride just saw an eccentric, quiet old man living out his twilight years in a secluded wooden cabin, but they did not know Arthur like I did. Before he retreated to the mountains, my father was one of the most ruthless, brilliant investment capitalists in Silicon Valley. He was a man who built empires and dismantled monopolies before breakfast. Beneath his faded flannel shirt beat the heart of an apex predator, a man who understood the intricate, cutthroat game of leverage better than anyone alive. And right now, sitting in the dark, that familiar, terrifyingly sharp intelligence was radiating from him in waves. "Dad," I choked out, the absolute despair finally settling heavily over my exhausted mind. "I lost everything. I have absolutely nothing left. He holds every single legal right. He has all the power. He stole everything from me." The cabin was engulfed in a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the sharp crackle of a burning pine log in the hearth. Arthur slowly reached for his own glass of bourbon. He took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the amber liquid coat his throat. Then, he leaned forward, resting his powerful forearms on his knees, and looked directly into my red, swollen eyes. The look on his face was not sorrow. It was a terrifying, absolute calm. "He never read page 9, my father whispered. The 5 words hung in the warm air, sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. I stared at him, my brain too battered to comprehend what he was saying. Without explaining further, my father stood up and walked over to the heavy rug covering the center of the living room floor. He pulled it back, revealing a hidden wooden trapdoor leading down into his root cellar. He disappeared into the dark earth for a few minutes. When he returned, he was carrying a heavy, rusted iron lockbox. He set it down heavily on the coffee table between us, the metallic thud echoing in the quiet room. He pulled a small brass key from his pocket, unlocked the box, and reached inside. He pulled out a thick stack of slightly yellowed, meticulously typed legal documents. It was the original seed funding contract from 10 years ago, when Luminary Design was just an ambitious idea and we were desperate for capital to launch. It was my father who had quietly provided the massive financial backing. Marcus had always confidently assumed it was just a standard, straightforward capital authorization document, a simple loan from a generous father-in-law to get the business off the ground. Marcus was so arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own superior business acumen, that he had merely skimmed the first few pages, signed his name on the dotted line, and celebrated his easy victory. But Arthur was not a man who handed out free money. Arthur was a grandmaster of the long game, And as I stared at the thick stack of paper resting in my father's weathered hands, I slowly began to realize that the man who had just thrown me out into the freezing snow was not the mastermind he believed himself to be. In the quiet, freezing weeks that followed that catastrophic holiday, my father and I did the exact opposite of what my husband expected. We vanished into absolute, suffocating silence. We did not hire a loud, aggressive attorney to immediately file emergency injunctions. I did not post tearful, hysterical videos on social media to expose his affair to the world. I did not call his wealthy clients to scream about my ruined marriage and demand their loyalty. To a man as deeply arrogant and severely narcissistic as him, my lack of retaliation could only mean one thing. It meant absolute, pathetic defeat. He truly believed he had broken my spirit so thoroughly that I was simply hiding in the mountains, licking my wounds, completely terrified of his immense power. He thought he had won the war before I even had the chance to draw my sword. The illusion of his ultimate victory fueled a sickening daily display of public gloating. He and Chloe paraded around Telluride like newly crowned royalty, openly living out their twisted fairy tale in the very house my hands had designed. But it was Vivian who truly reveled in her role as the wicked town crier. My former sister-in-law treated her social media accounts like a daily tabloid magazine. She updated her pages every single day with glamorous, high-resolution pictures of lavish dinner parties hosted in my dining room. She posted videos of herself clinking crystal glasses filled with imported champagne, showing off expensive designer dresses purchased entirely with company funds. More disgustingly, she made sure to whisper malicious, fabricated rumors into the eager ears of every prominent socialite in Colorado. The story she spun was a breathtaking masterpiece of fiction. According to Vivian, I was not the victim of a cruel betrayal, but an unstable, hysterical woman who had been secretly having affairs for months. She told everyone who would listen that her poor, saintly brother had been forced to kick me out into the snow because my severe psychological issues were actively destroying his business reputation. Bolstered by his own ridiculous delusions of grandeur, my soon-to-be ex-husband sent me an email halfway through the month. It was not an apology, nor was it a request for an amicable separation. It was a formal, heavily worded divorce settlement offer meticulously designed to completely humiliate me. He graciously offered me exactly $50,000 to permanently walk away from a design firm valued in the tens of millions, a company I had birthed from my own imagination. The email was drenched in venomous condescension, explicitly stating that this meager sum was a generous charity payment to help me get back on my feet. He even had the audacity to end the message with a thinly veiled threat. He warned me that if I dared to reject the money and drag him into court, he would personally ensure my professional reputation was so utterly ruined that I would never design so much as a wooden doghouse in the state of Colorado again. While he was busy building his fragile empire of lies, I was actively finding my center in the quiet, methodical rhythm of physical labor. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, I took a part-time job at a small, dusty woodworking shop down in the valley. There was something incredibly grounding and healing about the smell of raw pine sawdust and the loud, honest scream of a heavy table saw. Sanding down rough wooden edges and carving solid oak kept my hands busy and my mind razor-sharp. I needed that intense clarity, because every evening when I returned to the warm cabin, I became a predator quietly stalking her prey. I tracked every digital breadcrumb, compiling a massive, undeniable portfolio of his reckless spending. I documented the extravagant diamond jewelry purchases, the luxury hotel bookings from months before our separation, and the massive, unapproved cash withdrawals he was suddenly making from the corporate accounts. My father sat across from me one evening, watching the fire dance over the logs, and offered a piece of wisdom that became my daily mantra. "Silence is the absolute cheapest weapon you can wield," Arthur had said smoothly, his dark eyes calculating and cold. "But it is the one that kills the most painfully. Let him think he is completely invisible. Let him build his heavy castle on the sand." Following his exact instructions, I did not type a single angry word in reply to that insulting email. Instead, I quietly gathered his written threats, the damning financial statements, and every single one of Vivian's boastful geotagged photographs, and forwarded them directly to a highly confidential, extraordinarily expensive lawyer my father had discreetly retained in Denver. By the time late January rolled around, his ego had inflated to dangerous, catastrophic proportions. Drunk on his unchallenged power and desperate to please his demanding new mistress, he made a fatal, irreversible error. He decided that the master suite was not quite grand enough for his growing new family. Without bothering to consult a single architectural board, without checking a single local zoning permit, he hired a cheap, unlicensed demolition crew to brutally tear down the historic, load-bearing stone wall in the east wing of the mansion to build a massive new nursery. He was absolutely confident that he was the sole master of his domain, completely untouchable, and completely free to destroy and rebuild whatever he pleased. He had absolutely no idea that every single swing of the heavy sledgehammer was driving another permanent nail directly into his own coffin. The first legal mediation took place in a meticulously sterile, aggressively modern boardroom on the 50th floor of a prestigious Denver law firm. The massive glass walls offered a sweeping panoramic view of the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. But the atmosphere inside the room was thick with a suffocating, almost electric tension. I sat quietly next to my attorney, a sharp, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Vance, whom my father had handpicked for this exact moment. Precisely at 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors swung open. My soon-to-be ex-husband strolled in, flanked by a high-profile, incredibly expensive divorce attorney who wore a bespoke pinstripe suit and a practiced, predatory smile. Marcus looked like a man who had already won the lottery. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating an overwhelming, almost comical level of arrogance. He did not even bother to look at me as he took his seat across the long mahogany table. He simply unbuttoned his jacket, leaned back comfortably in his plush leather chair, and let out a soft, condescending sigh, acting as though this entire legal proceeding was nothing more than a minor, irritating delay in his very busy schedule. A moment later, the door opened one last time. My father walked in. He was not dressed in his usual mountain flannel. Today, Arthur wore a pristine, impeccably tailored dark navy suit that seemed to absorb the light in the room. He walked with the slow, deliberate grace of a lion entering a cage full of blind mice. He took the empty seat directly to my right, placing his large, weathered hands flat on the polished wood. He was here formally as my acting financial advisor. His absolute, chilling calmness instantly changed the air pressure in the room. I watched Marcus shift slightly in his chair, his arrogant smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second when he met the dead, unblinking stare of my father. The opposing counsel cleared his throat, opening his sleek leather briefcase with a loud, theatrical snap. He immediately took control of the room, speaking in a smooth, heavily patronizing tone. He laid a thick stack of glossy documents down in the center of the table, tapping them with his gold pen. "We are here today to expedite this unfortunate separation," Marcus's lawyer began, looking at me with thinly veiled pity. "My client is an incredibly busy man, and a remarkably generous one. Despite the fact that your client has zero legal standing, zero equity in Luminaire Design, and absolutely no legal claim to the Telluride estate, my client is still willing to offer a final severance payment of $50,000. This is a courtesy, Mr. Vance, a charity gesture to help her transition into a new phase of life. We have the corporate registration certificates and the property deed right here, completely solidifying that my client is the sole, undisputed owner of all assets." Marcus crossed his arms, staring at me with a triumphant, malicious gleam in his eyes. He was waiting for me to break down, to beg, to realize that I was completely beaten. He wanted me to cry in that expensive boardroom. Instead, "Mr." Vance smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a hunter who had just heard the heavy metal teeth of a bear trap snap shut. "That is a very fascinating narrative, counselor, Mr. Vance said smoothly, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "However, I believe your client has fundamentally misunderstood his own professional existence. Mr. Vance reached into his own briefcase and pulled out the weathered, slightly yellowed documents from my father's iron lockbox. He gently pushed the original seed funding contract across the mahogany table. "You see, Mr. Vance continued, leaning forward. "Luminaire Design and the Telluride estate have never belonged to your client, not for a single day. 10 years ago, when this company was founded, the initial capital was provided entirely by my client's father, Mr. Arthur here, but the funds were not a loan, and they were certainly not a gift." The opposing lawyer frowned, hastily grabbing the yellowed contract. Marcus suddenly leaned forward, his confident posture breaking as severe confusion flashed across his face. "This document, Mr. Vance stated loudly, pointing a sharp finger at the papers, clearly establishes that all capital, all intellectual property, and all real estate purchased under the Luminaire name are the exclusive property of a private holding trust. A trust controlled entirely by Arthur, your client. Marcus is not an owner, he is not a founder, he is, by strict legal definition, merely an authorized operator, an employee, a glorified manager who was granted honorary, non-voting shares purely for administrative purposes." "That is absolutely ridiculous," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking violently, the smug composure completely vanishing from his face. He slammed his fist on the table. "My name is on the state registration. My name is on the property deed." "As an acting trustee, yes," Mr. Vance fired back, his tone turning as cold as ice. "A status which is completely revocable under the specific terms of the founding agreement, which brings us to the most important part of today's meeting. Mr. Vance instructed the opposing attorney to turn to the 9th page of the document. The room fell into a deathly paralyzing silence as the expensive lawyer's eyes darted rapidly across the dense legal text. Page 9 contains a very standard, yet highly binding moral turpitude and fraud clause. Mr. Vance explained, his voice ringing with absolute authority. It explicitly states that if the authorized operator utilizes the trust's funds for fraudulent, deceptive, or unauthorized personal purposes, or if the operator commits a severe, publicly documented violation of marital fidelity, his position is immediately terminated. In such an event, every single honorary share, every single drop of administrative power, evaporates instantly. The assets revert 100% to the primary beneficiary of the trust. That beneficiary is Irene. Marcus's face turned the color of wet ash. The blood completely drained from his cheeks. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. His chest began to heave as panic set in. "We have submitted comprehensive financial evidence," Mr. Vance continued relentlessly, tossing a thick folder of bank statements, credit card receipts, and geotagged photographs onto the table. "We have undeniable proof of tens of thousands of dollars in unapproved corporate withdrawals used to purchase diamond jewelry for a mistress. We have proof of company credit cards being used to fund luxury hotel stays for an extramarital affair. By your client's own documented, arrogant actions, he has triggered the moral turpitude clause." The opposing lawyer was gripping the contract so tightly, his knuckles had turned completely white. He read page 9 over and over again, desperately searching for a loophole, a typo, a technicality, a way out. There was none. The trap my father had built a decade ago was utterly flawless, cast in iron and bound by airtight corporate law. The expensive slick attorney slowly lowered the documents to the table. His hands were visibly shaking. He took off his custom designer glasses, completely ignoring the frantic, terrified breathing of his own client. The lawyer slowly turned his head, looking at Marcus with a mixture of absolute professional horror and deep, profound disgust. "Did you really never read this page?" the lawyer asked, his voice trembling slightly in the dead quiet of the room. Marcus sat frozen, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with the catastrophic realization that he had just proudly walked himself right up the steps of the guillotine. The devastation was not gradual. It was instantaneous and absolute. By 2 o'clock that very afternoon, the brutal reality of his catastrophic arrogance crashed down on his head like an avalanche, because he had foolishly hired an unlicensed crew to aggressively demolish the historic stone wall of the Telluride mansion, a property strictly governed and protected by the trust. He had committed severe, unauthorized property damage. The local historical preservation board, combined with the lethal legal wrath of our attorneys, slapped him with a massive, immediate penalty amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Since he had acted completely outside his authority as a mere operator, he was held personally liable for every single penny of the structural restoration. Panicked, sweating, and completely desperate, Marcus rushed to his private bank in downtown Denver to secure the funds. He thought he could simply drain the corporate reserves to save his own skin, just as he had always done. But my father had always been 10 steps ahead. The very second that legal mediation meeting ended, Arthur had executed a total, uncompromising freeze on every single bank account tied to Luminaire Design. The corporate credit lines were instantly and permanently severed. The massive vault of wealth Marcus thought he completely controlled was violently slammed shut and locked behind ironclad legal barriers. Standing at the marble counter of the bank, his face burning with public humiliation, he discovered he could not withdraw a single cent to pay off the astronomical debt he had racked up on his black credit cards, the exact same cards he had recklessly used to fund his lavish, secret life. The dominoes continued to fall with spectacular, ruthless speed when Marcus finally returned to the damaged, freezing mansion that evening, completely empty-handed and facing total bankruptcy. The grand illusion of his power instantly evaporated. Chloe, the young, supposedly devoted woman who was meant to be his real family, took one look at the legal foreclosure notices and the frozen banking applications on his phone. The moment she realized her powerful, wealthy titan of a boyfriend was actually nothing more than a fired, disgraced employee drowning in a sea of debt, her unconditional love vanished into thin air, without shedding a single tear. She frantically packed all the expensive designer clothes, the pure silk scarves, and the diamond jewelry he had bought her with stolen money. She loaded her bags into a waiting car and fled into the dark night. She did not even leave a goodbye note. Instead, she left him a massive, towering stack of unpaid catering invoices and luxury shopping bills piled high on the kitchen island. By the very next morning, the explosive news of his spectacular downfall had spread through the wealthy, gossiping circles of Colorado like a raging wildfire. My phone began to vibrate violently on the wooden table of the cabin. The caller identification flashed Vivian's name over and over again. When I finally decided to answer, the cruel, venomous woman who had gleefully kicked my luggage into the snow was entirely gone. In her place was a hysterical, sobbing mess. She cried uncontrollably, her voice cracking and pitching as she begged for my mercy. She pleaded with me to remember the good times we used to share, begging me not to throw her precious brother out onto the cold street. She frantically insisted that he was just severely stressed from work and had made a silly, harmless mistake. I listened to her pathetic, desperate wailing for a solid 30 seconds. I did not utter a single word in response. I simply hung up the phone. Then, I opened my digital messages and sent her exactly one thing. It was a screenshot of the very same mocking, a glamorous photograph she had proudly posted on Christmas Eve. The one where she had raised a glass of champagne to celebrate my banishment into the blizzard. I hit send, watched the message deliver, and permanently blocked her number. The final, fatal blow was the absolute destruction of his professional identity. In the tight-knit, elite world of high-end architecture, reputation is the only currency that truly matters. The shocking revelation that Marcus had not only been aggressively faking his ownership for an entire decade, but had also actively embezzled corporate funds to buy jewelry for a mistress spread to every major firm and contractor in the state. He was completely and utterly blacklisted. No reputable developer, no wealthy client, and absolutely no partner would ever dare to do business with a man who had been so humiliatingly stripped of his operating rights for fraud and moral bankruptcy. The brilliant, untouchable businessman had been reduced to a toxic, radioactive liability. He had confidently tried to bury me in the freezing snow, but he had merely ended up digging his own inescapable grave. The final court hearing arrived with the gentle, welcoming thaw of spring. The heavy mountain snow had finally melted across the valley, and so had the long, agonizing nightmare of my divorce. The legal proceedings were astonishingly brief. When a trust contract is forged in the absolute fires of my father's legal brilliance, there is absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. The judge pounded his heavy wooden gavel, formally validating every single clause of the document. With a few decisive strokes of a pen, I was officially declared the chief executive officer and the sole, undisputed owner of Luminary Design. I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I had in a decade, but as I made my way down the long, echoing marble hallway toward the exit, a pathetic, trembling shadow stepped directly into my path. It was Marcus. The expensive, bespoke tailored suits and his commanding, arrogant posture were completely gone. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray jacket. His shoulders slumped forward in total, crushing defeat. His face was pale, unshaven, and deeply lined with profound exhaustion. He looked like an utterly broken man. Tears instantly welled up in his eyes as he looked at me. "Irene, please," he begged, his voice cracking and weak. "I am so incredibly sorry. I completely lost my mind. The heavy pressure of the business, the constant stress of maintaining an image, it completely ruined my judgment. Please, I am begging you. Just give me one more chance. I will do anything. Let me come back to the firm. I will work as a junior draftsman. I will sweep the floors. I just need a job. I have absolutely nothing left." I stopped and looked intently at the man I had once planned to spend the rest of my natural life with. I searched my heart for a spark of burning anger, a lingering desire for revenge, or even a tiny shred of sadness, but there was absolutely nothing left inside me. There was only a quiet, profound pity. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with absolute, icy clarity. "You did not lose me because you cheated, Marcus. You lost me because you sold your soul to exchange for cheap vanity. Page 9 did not strip you of your assets. Your own greed did exactly that." He opened his mouth to speak, but the pathetic words died in his throat. I did not wait for his reply. I turned my back and walked straight toward the heavy glass exit doors. I did not look over my shoulder a single time, leaving him completely paralyzed in the cold hallway, drowning in the suffocating weight of his own delayed regret and permanent despair. Exactly 1 year later, the harsh winds of winter returned to Telluride, but this time, the freezing cold could not touch me. It was Christmas Eve. I stood on the grand master balcony of my beautiful mansion, gazing out at the snow-covered pine trees. The massive house had been entirely renovated, thoroughly cleansed of every single memory of the betrayal, and completely rebuilt to match my exact personal vision. Under my newly established leadership, Luminary Design had not just survived the scandal, we had thrived, securing multiple international contracts and achieving record-breaking revenue for the entire year. The heavy glass sliding door opened behind me. My father, Arthur, stepped out into the crisp winter air and gently wrapped a thick, warm cashmere coat over my shoulders. I smiled and handed him a heavy crystal glass of dark red wine. We stood quietly side by side, clinking our glasses together under the magnificent, starry Colorado sky. As I leaned against my father's shoulder, I finally understood the greatest, most important lesson of my entire life. A true home is never built by the legal name typed on a piece of paper. It is built by unwavering kindness, sharp wisdom, and the rare, beautiful people who are completely ready to catch you when you fall, even when you have lost everything. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where all of you are listening from. so please leave a comment and let me know. If you found today's story engaging and powerful, please help us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to the absolute best, most detailed, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code right on your screen, or by using the link provided in the description and the pinned comment below. Thank you for your time, and take care.